Test for the Pearl by Vaseleos Garson, originally published in Planet Stories, Fall 1947. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Far off in the steaming Venusian jungle, a band of the Chameleon men halted, lifting their mottled faces in the direction of the sound. Closer in, a four-man jungle patrol of Earthmen broke as one man into a run along the trail, their swift-moving bodies swishing the clouds into ragged streamers. At the end of the viscous river circling the island, an armed guard slipped on his infrared glasses and began searching his area carefully, his special light travelling slowly along the river and its near and opposite banks. On the island, only a few yards from the high, thick walls of the interplanetary prison, a patch of ground, approximately 8 feet by 5, quivered once, and was still. The deep-throated roar of the escape siren was thunderous. It carried for scores of miles through the steamy atmosphere of the planet, alerting both natives and Earthman patrols to a successful break from that most fabulous of prisons, the hole. Behind the oxygen mask he wore, lying under a foot of the thick, spongy soil of the planet, Jarl Gare wiggled his itching body and chuckled. He nudged Waltk, the huge Jovian who lay beside him. "Don't get restless now," he mumbled through the mask. "We have hours to wait, and somebody might spot this patch of ground if you keep wriggling." The Jovian grunted, wriggled again, and then was quiet. "Men have escaped from the hole before," Jarl Gare muttered, "but they were always caught before they got to the pearl beds. Walt's body and my brain will get us through." He envisioned one of the huge Venusian pearls, so rare and so precious on Earth that it could buy a man's freedom, even from a murder charge. Jarl Gare fell asleep, dreaming of a bauble as big as his head. He was awakened by a nudge. "It is night," Walt grunted. "I smell it." Gare worked one hand up through the spongy earth, poked a hole in it, and wiped the mud from his mask's eyepiece. "Right," he muttered. "It's time to go." He worked his head out of the ground and looked about. There could be infrared spotlights covering the very ground under which they lay, but they would have to take the chance. His body made a sucking sound as he drew himself from the self-dug grave. He reached back in and tapped Waltk. The big Jovian virtually erupted from the ground, the weight nothing to his mighty thews. Carefully they replaced the spongy earth. Then, with Jarl Gare in the lead, the pair walked upright, but quietly, to the great power-charged fence. It went up 20 feet, and down the same distance underground. Jarl Gare had learned this depth from a prisoner who had tried to dig his way out, but failed, and nearly drowned as liquid seeped into the hole he was digging. The big Jovian, his thick-thewed body glimmering with sweat in the ground light, bent to pick up Jarl Gare's slight, naked body. "Wait," Jarl Gare warned. "We must wait until one of the river beasts starts plunging." The Jovian grunted. He waited, flexing the great shoulder and back muscles. Then he said suddenly, "I smell guards." Jarl Gare's thin face jerked up at the 7-foot figure of his companion. "Where?" he asked tensely. The Jovian, with a quick movement, shoved Jarl Gare to the ground, dropped flat swiftly himself, and wriggled away through the short grass. Jarl Gare waited quietly. The big Jovian, whose eyes, trained on his homeworld of darkness, penetrated the steamy fog of Venus almost as well as an infrared lamp, would take care of the guards his nostrils had scented. That was the way Jarl Gare had planned it. Walt's strength, nearly a dozen times greater than that of an earthling, his hearing developed to a tremendous acuity by the environment of his homeworld, and his eyesight were the tools of Jarl's brain. If Walt had had Jarl's brain, he could have won a Venusian pearl, but while nature had given him a marvelous machine for survival, she had only given him just enough brain to keep it operating. His work would be done when they reached the Venusian pearl beds. One glance at the bulky figure and the Venusians would know the weakness. But it did not matter if he lost. Jarl Ger would still win a pearl. I have no weakness, Jarl grinned to himself, except pride, and the Venusians seek out physical or mental weakness, not a character weakness. He remembered the oft-told tale of the Earthman whom the Venusians had frightened to death, but that was because he showed that fear physically. 3 years in the hole, and you either go raving mad or learn to mask every emotion. Abruptly, Walt was back. "There were 2, he said. 2 no more." "Did they have fog piercers?" Jarl Ger asked. "Yes," Walt grunted. "I remembered what you said." He handed over a pair of glasses and a special light. "You would not need these. I see enough for both of us." There was a muted splash from the river. Walt's great hands seized Jarl Ger about the waist and lifted him. 3 splashes, then heave, Jarl Ger said. The next splash was louder, the second louder and longer, and, when the third crashed into the night, Jarl Ger was flung as if from a catapult over the fence. As his naked body struck the river, his mind exulted. It was perfect timing, the splash of the river beast drowning out his own. Jarl Ger trod water, waiting. The Jovian's hurtling figure was a dark blotch against the fog. Jarl swallowed a deep breath of air before the splash of water from the Jovian's body struck him. The 2 of them floated quietly, letting the river water grow sluggish again. The splashing of the beasts grew nearer. Jarl Ger heard the big Jovian breathing hoarsely. He said reassuringly, "They are harmless, Walt. I told you so a dozen times." "I have never seen one of them," Walt said hoarsely. "I fear nothing I have seen. You have only told me of them." Only a few feet away, one of the river beasts suddenly lunged out of the water. Walt squealed as a huge body loomed in the air over them, then landed between them, sending spray cascading over them. Walt struck out at the beast and then began to chuckle. Jarl Ger heard the chuckle through the echoes of the splash. The beast was gone. "Look," said Walt, holding up one hand. It held a blob of dripping flesh. "It is weak. I have seen it, and I am unafraid." For answer, Jarl Ger, who had just donned the infrared glasses, tapped Walt on the shoulder and plunged under the water. He had sighted the ray of an infrared light on the river. Jarl Ger swam under water, moving with the current. He felt the movement of the water behind him and knew Walt was following. He angled for the far bank. On arrival, he slid his head and eyes out carefully. The infrared light was far up the river, following the jumping river beasts. Without ripple or sound, Walt broke the surface of the river. Their 2 naked bodies glistening with the water, Jarl Ger and Walt stepped out of the river and slid into the luxurious growth of the jungle. One step in the climb to freedom and wealth had been accomplished. Jarl Ger chuckled, patting the mighty arms of his companion. "Can you lead us in a straight line through the jungle if I give you a pointer?" Jarl Ger asked. He knew the answer, but he liked to preen his ego on the knowledge that his brain had evolved the plan. Walt grunted. "Look back at the hole," Jarl Ger said. The Jovian turned, his eyes intent. "I see it," he said. "The high radio tower?" The Jovian grunted. "The guards' barracks." Again the Jovian grunted. "Draw an imaginary line from the tower through the center of the barracks. Our path will extend along that line." "Come," said Wolk. He led Jarl Gare back up the river, watching the tower. He halted finally, facing across the river, and then made an abrupt about-face. He closed his eyes and stood tense, unmoving as minutes dripped past. "I have it," he said. "Brains," chuckled Jarl Gare to himself. "Use every weapon, every tool." But it was easy. Wolk was of a race which had developed for self-preservation the sense of taking a straight line between 2 points. In their vast world, where landmarks were absent, it was a necessity. Here on Venus, that sense would lead Jarl Gare to freedom and wealth. It was like a radio beam on the space lanes, but the Jovian needed no sending station. He was the station itself, able to orient himself if he went off course. They started out through the jungle, naked and unarmed, aiming straight for the Venusian pearl beds which, by Jarl Gare's estimate, lay 300 miles north of the hole. 300 miles between hell and heaven. Wolk was tireless, his great body immune to the ravages of the sharp-edged undergrowth and the strangling vines. He had no need of a path. He made his own, guided by that unfailing sense of direction. Jarl Gare slid along in the Jovian's wake, his passage cleared by the strength of his companion. Jarl used his infrared lamp sparingly, for fear Earth patrols might be wearing the special glasses and discover the beam. The patrols were tough and relentless. They shot first and then asked questions. Jarl used the lamp to reassure himself, even though Wolk grunted when anything out of the ordinary appeared, describing it to his companion. Their first sleep came when Jarl Gare judged they had come almost a third of the distance to the pearl beds. He suppressed the hunger pains in his belly by telling Wolk again the story of the Venusian pearls. They lay in a cradle of a great tree whose 5 great arms spread out from the trunk. "I saw one once, Wolk," Jarl Gare said, and his voice was soft. "It was back on Earth, and it was the property of one of the richest men on Earth, Voltaine, inventor of the force field that protects space cruisers from asteroids and space fragments. He gave half his wealth for it, and he was rated as worth 4 million credits. 2 million credits for a jewel. He was a fool," Wolk said. "Ah, but Wolk, you should have seen it. He displayed it once a month in public, and the crowds that gathered. It was grey, but it pulsed and throbbed as if it were alive." Wolk said seriously, "I did not know these pearls were grey. I had heard they were pink or red or orange. I never heard of a grey one." "Nor had I," Jarl Gare nodded. "But there it was. It wasn't the colour that attracted me, but the life force that seemed to throb within it. That day I decided I would have one, though I knew there were only 4 of them on Earth. But there was no way for me to get to Venus." "I know," said Wolk. "You have told me. You were earthbound because you had been in Earth police custody too often. But you made a plan. Earthman convicted of treason, murder, and other high crimes was sent to the hole. So you killed a man." "And was sent to the hole. But for you, Wolk, my plan would have failed. I needed your strength, your instinct, your eyes. I promised you a pearl, too." "You have already given it to me," Wolk said quietly. "Freedom from the hole, if only for a while. Because you led me from the hole, I will help you until your quest is ended. I swear it." Jarl Ger chuckled to himself. "The simple-minded brute! He thinks he's free. For the moment, sure, but when he meets the Venusians, he's done. Good riddance. A tool should be discarded if there's no more use for it." The gentle touch of Walt's big hand on his shoulder awakened him. "The Chameleon men," Walt whispered. Hastily, Jarl Ger slipped on the glasses and seized the light. "Where?" he asked. "They are in a circle about the tree." Jarl Ger swerved the light around the tree. 100 yards away was the edge of the circle. The infrared showed them, dark, hunched figures. "They just seemed to be waiting for something," Jarl Ger said. "Us," Walt said laconically. Jarl Ger went through the card catalogue of his brain. The Chameleon men, the Venusian natives, evolved from reptiles who walked upright, were intelligent, but could converse with men only through thought pictures. They were the guardians of the pearl beds. Their vision in their fog world was as good, if not better, than Walt's. They needed no infrared rays to penetrate the fog as the Earthmen did. They had fought viciously against colonization by Earthmen. Despite punitive measures by Earth, they were not conquered, and finally there had been an Earth-Venus treaty. Earthmen were permitted access to the oil fields and were allowed to create the whole. In token of the Great Pact, the Earth had given its largest, most perfect diamond to Venus. Venus, ruled by its hierarchy of the guardian priests, had given a pearl. The pearl had touched off cupidity on Earth, and adventurers by the score had attempted to wrest others. Earth at first had sought to halt the adventurers, but Venus had replied cryptically, "Let them come. If they can obtain a pearl, they have won it fairly." Of the hundreds who had tried, only 3 had won through successfully. Only 3 had been strong enough to pass the test of weakness. If an Earthman made it to the pearl beds, he was given the test of weakness. If he passed it, he went free with a pearl of his choice. If he lost, he disappeared. Only 3. And Jarl Ger chuckled. Soon there would be 4. Jarl Ger. The Venusians were sluggish-moving and web-footed, perfectly at home on their spongy earth. But in the trees? Jarl Ger spoke quietly to Walt. "We can escape them by travelling through the trees." "I could," said Walt, "but you would be too slow. They would capture you." Jarl Ger looked at Walt appraisingly. "On your back, I would not slow you too much." Walt grinned widely, his moon face wrinkling. He laughed throatily. "You would not slow me at all. I had not thought of that." Jarl Ger's ray gun swept the circle again. "I wish I could see them," he said. "I'd like to know what they looked like if I met them face to face." Walt's eyes turned to one of the waiting figures. "They are as tall as you. Their heads are conical, set on sloping shoulders without much neck. Their bodies are mottled green and red and brown. They carry 2-pronged spears. Their feet are webbed." "I have seen pictures of them," Jarl Ger said, "but they weren't coloured. I remember reading that they can change the colours of their skin to blend with surroundings." "They blend well," Walt said. "It was difficult for me to see them at first after I had sensed them." Walt slung Jarl Ger on his back. A tensing of his mighty thews in one leap took them to a tree 30 feet away. Then they were swinging swiftly through the upper reaches of the forest, propelled by the Jovian strength, made even more powerful by the lesser gravitational pull of Venus. A mile away, Walt halted, while Jarl Ger swept the forest behind him with an infrared ray. He laughed. "They're still sitting there, waiting for us." "Good," said Walt. "It is easier to travel in the trees." He resumed the role of carrier and went plunging on. The hours of flight through the trees seemed hardly to touch the reserves of the Jovian's strength. But suddenly, abruptly, he halted. "We cannot go further through the trees," he said to a puzzled Jarl Ger. "The end of the forest ahead?" Jarl Ger asked. "That means we're less than 100 Earth miles from the beds." "No," Walt said. "Not the end of the forest. There is something I don't understand. I feel a pressure ahead of us, as if some horrible fate awaits us." Jarl Ger's first reaction was to brush away Walt's fears, as if merely caused by not understanding what lay ahead. It was like Walt's fear of the water beasts. But then he remembered the intuitive sense the Jovians had. "We'd better go down then," Jarl Ger decided. "No," said Walt. "It is the same there." "Then we'll go around it. Come on." An ironic smile blossomed on Walt's moon face. "It is the same everywhere," he said. "To either side, above, below, ahead, and behind us." Jarl Ger, whose fierce desire for a Venusian pearl had lifted him above panic, felt only a twinge of exasperation. "I feel nothing," he said, irritated. "Why can't we keep going?" The Jovian shrugged. "I feel we can't." "Hell," said Jarl Ger. "I'll go down and show you." Jarl Ger's wiry, whip-scarred body slid down the limb on which they stood until it reached the crotch of the huge tree. He started down the trunk. Walt watched him quietly. Jarl Ger stopped suddenly. Then, slowly, he inched his way back up the trunk to the limb where the Jovian stood. "I see what you mean," he said. "This was something I hadn't figured on." He sat down on the limb, letting his legs dangle. Whatever had them hemmed in wasn't intangible. It was real. His foot had touched it. It had felt cold and gave slightly. Jarl Ger brought the foot up and looked at the toes. They looked unharmed, but seemed numb. He pinched them and felt no more sensation than if they had grown numb from loss of circulation. They were cold to his touch. Was that force thin-skinned like a balloon, or solid as a plasticine ball? "Walt," he said, "break me off a good-sized branch." The Jovian slid farther out on the limb, snapped off a branch the thickness of his wrist and about 3 feet long, and brought it to Jarl Ger. "Watch it closely," he ordered Walt. He dropped the heavy branch. It fell about 20 feet and stopped abruptly. Then slowly, like a ruptured duralloy canoe, it started downward again, but gaining speed. It struck the ground, but neither Walt nor Jarl Ger could hear it strike. Then the force wasn't solid. He became aware that the foot which had touched the force was beginning to tingle. The power it released to numb was only temporary then. Jarl Ger chuckled. Their bodies might be numbed for a while, but they would be free of the force. Quickly he slid down the branch again. At approximately the same spot where he'd stopped before, he halted again and reached out tentatively with his toes, touching the numbness. He looked back at Walt. "Follow me," he ordered. Then Jarl Ger jumped. It was like leaping into frigid water from a steaming shower bath. The shock wiped the consciousness from Jarl Ger, but not before he felt his body falling freely. He didn't feel the lesser shock as his body struck the spongy sward of the jungle. Awareness that his face hurt came to Jarl Ger first. It was a recurring pain. First it stung, then the pain retreated. Then it stung again. He realized that somebody was methodically slapping his face. He opened his eyes. Walt stopped slapping him. The big Jovian was grinning. "It is all above us now," he said. Jarl Ger stood up and almost fell down again, staggering, feeling no sensation in his legs. Walt supported him. "It will leave. My body is tingling only pleasantly now." Sensations came back quickly. Even Jarl's eyes began to tingle in harmony with the 1,000 prickles that coursed over his body. Finally, he could limp along, and as the power returned to his muscles, he began to step out briskly. "What was it?" Walt asked. Jarl Ger shrugged. "I don't know for sure, but it must have been some sort of thin force field, able to resist concerted pressure, but not quick, sharp shocks like our leaping bodies." The tangled jungle finally dwindled away, and the pair were striding across fields rich with vegetation. "It is beautiful," Walt declared. "Such bright colors shining like jewels through this fog." Jarl Ger glanced at Walt sharply, and then at the grey vegetation. He grinned. "I wish I had your eyes, Walt, or been raised on Jupiter where I'd have developed such keen perception." Walt shrugged his big shoulders. "You Earthmen have good eyes too, but you do not need them as much as we do." "Are we still heading right?" Jarl Ger asked. Walt nodded. They plodded on. That night they supped on a queer animal that Walt had run down and throttled with his bare hands. It tasted like beefsteak. Walt ate prodigiously, but Jarl Ger, who wanted to be sharp and quick on the morrow, ate sparingly. During the night, Jarl awakened several times, his nerves on edge for the test he knew lay ahead, but Walt slept heavily. When they awakened, the Chameleon men were there. Walt was on his feet instantly, his great hands reaching out. Jarl came to his feet more slowly, wondering that the Chameleon men had not slain them while they slept. The skins of the Chameleon men were a mottled grey, coloured to match the grey background in which they lived, he observed. There were a dozen of them ranged around the big Jovian and the slight Earthman. Their barbed, two-pronged spears were held lightly in their webbed hands, and their lidless eyes stared blankly at the naked pair. Jarl Ger waited quietly, one hand on the powerful biceps of his companion. Finally, he became aware of a picture growing in his mind, of a vine and tree-latticed river sprouting out of a jungle into a deep pool. All around the edges of the pool were stacked great piles of huge oyster shells. The surface of the pool broke regularly, conical heads popped out, and the mottled bodies swam toward shore, depositing the huge shells where they were taken by other Chameleon men, expertly split open and examined. 1 out of 3 yielded a pulsating pearl. Then into Jarl Ger's mind came another picture. He and Walt leaping through the trees, then jumping through the force field, finally coming to the fields, leaving the jungle behind. Then a picture of the pearl beds again. Now a picture of strange men, wrestling with the Chameleon men, throwing great weights, leaping, diving into the pool, racing against the Chameleon men in their own element. A great sigh lifted Jarl Ger's breast. "Walt," he cried, "we have passed all but the final test. One more, and the pearls are ours." The Chameleon men nodded and turned to march ahead of them across the fields. Jarl Ger was exulting. "I will win a pearl, a glorious grey pearl pulsing with life and beauty. I have no weakness, Walt. My quest is almost over." Walt said quietly, "You have a weakness, Jarl. Perhaps I can help you." Jarl Ger drew his slight body taut. "I need no help now, Walt. I used you when I needed you. I don't need you any longer. I will win out alone. With all your strength, you are weaker than I." Wolsk stared at him. "You do not like me? You have just used what I have to help yourself." "Yes, you big dumb ox," Jarlger gloated. "Your weakness is too obvious. You're strong, but the Venusians have tests for such strength, and even your mighty body will fail." "And you have no weakness?" Wolsk asked. "Suppose they give you the test of strength." "The Chameleon men don't do it that way. They read your mind, almost, and figure out a test that should not be impossible, if you are uniformly strong in body, mind, and courage. The test is for all three, and you must have the brains to go with strength." "I see," Wolsk said, and when he looked at Jarlger, there was almost a sense of pity in the glance. At last they came to the pool. Out of the fog-shrouded lake came the Chameleon men, their bodies dripping, their webbed hands carrying the great shells. The band of Chameleon men, leading the Jovian and the Earthman, halted. Two of them dived into the pool. After long minutes, the pair reappeared, lugging between them a gigantic clam. They set it down before Wolsk. They stared at Wolsk. Finally, Wolsk grinned and nodded. With their metal spears, 4 of the Chameleon men pried open the bivalve and held it open by standing on the shell edges. Wolsk flexed his great muscles and clamped a huge hand on each shell edge. Jarlger's yellow eyes widened. Wolsk's test was to hold open the clam, a prodigious feat. For how long? One of the Chameleon men glanced at Jarlger, and he saw a picture of darkness descending on the pool. "Why, that must be 6 hours." The 4 Venusians stepped off the shell. The clam's writhing muscles and the great writhing muscles of the Jovian's back tensed together. The Chameleon men stared blankly at the striving pair. Jarlger watched passively. If the dumb ox couldn't figure out that all he had to do was to shove the clam open still further instead of bracing against closure, he would lose the test. The moments dripped by, became minutes marked by the jumping back and shoulder muscles of the Jovian. An hour passed sluggishly. Wolsk's usually white face became suffused with red. His chest was labouring. At the end of 2 hours, Wolsk glanced appealingly over his shoulder at Jarlger. The Earthman laughed. With a convulsive effort, Wolsk pushed back the shells 6 inches either way. If he had done that at first, he could have won, Jarlger thought, but not now. Wolsk's strength had been drained too greatly. The great shells quivered, moving back. Wolsk strained, but the Jovian's great muscles could hold no longer. The Jovian's huge body quivered, the skin grew almost black with his great effort. The clam had the leverage now. Its white muscles pulsed. The Jovian grunted with pain. There was a deep, thucking sound. Wolsk whimpered. Then the Jovian stood up. He stared at the blood pulsing from the stumps of his wrists. The clam had sheared off his hands. "Sorry," Jarlger said, and laughed. The Jovian's face convulsed with fury. Then he relaxed. His moon face was smiling as he looked at Jarlger. "Your turn now," he said. The Venusians gathered around Wolsk. One of them took a pouch from beneath his breech-clout. His webbed fingers dug in and came out with a salve that he smeared on the spurting wrist stumps. The blood ceased spurting. Then the Venusians turned to Jarlger. They circled him, but broke the circle a little to let a wizened Venusian through. He was carrying a Venusian pearl. Jarlger gasped at the size of the pearl. He reached out for it, But the old wizened Venusian drew back, and a picture grew in Gare's mind. "You're going to hide it in an oyster shell, and throw that shell in with a pile of others?" The conical, wrinkled head bowed. The wizened oldster reached into a pouch inside his breech-clout and pulled out a handful of grey powder. The Venusians moved toward the pool, forcing Jarl Gare to move along with them. At the pool's edge, the old Venusian dipped in a wrinkled hand and drew out a handful of water. He mixed the water with the powder until it became the consistency of paste. Jarl Gare watched as the old Venusian smeared the oyster shell one of the other Chameleon men handed him with the greyish paste. Then Jarl Gare saw the great grey pearl handed to the old man. He placed the pearl in the shell. Then the other Venusians turned Jarl Gare away from the oldster, one of them placing his cold-webbed fingers across the Earthman's eyes. Jarl Gare heard the rattle of the old shells, other rustling motions behind him as he waited. What test was this that Chameleon men were planning? Finally, the hands dropped from his eyes. He turned around. The oldster was pointing at a huge pile of the oyster shells. A picture was in Jarl Gare's mind again. So they wanted him to find the shell. That was a fine test. All the shells were grey, and the pile to which the elder pointed was approximately 20 feet high. How could he find one grey shell among so many other grey ones? He looked up and saw Walt grinning at him, the stumps of his arms folded. "How can I find it?" he asked Walt. "One grey one among so many others." "Grey?" asked Walt. "It is not grey. It sticks out of that pile like a torch. The shell is smeared with red." "Red?" asked Jarl Gare curiously. "Red? I see no red." "That's right," Walt said, and there was laughter in his voice. "You're colour-blind, Earthman. I knew it when you first told me the vegetation was grey, that the pearls were grey. The Chameleon men knew it too. You said they almost could read your mind." Walt threw back his head and roared with laughter. Jarl Gare spun his eyes to the Chameleon men who were watching. A picture grew in his mind. He had until sunset to find the shell, the red shell, and he was colour-blind. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. From the pages of dusty old pulp magazines to your ear.